Lesson 42, Continuing Revelation to Latter-day Prophets. So if you look at the manual, the teacher's manual for this lesson, there is a few different points that it gives you to talk about. And one of them is a recent revelation that was given. And as I read through the manual and as I thought about it, I thought I would just focus on that one revelation, maybe the history behind it, what it was, the impact that it had, and then, discuss how that can impact us in our lives. So, to start off with, a little video.
In early June of this year, the First Presidency announced that a revelation had been received by President Spencer W. Kimball extending priesthood and temple blessings to all worthy male members of the church. President Kimball has asked that I advise the conference that after he received this revelation, which came to him after extended meditation and prayer in the sacred rooms of the Holy Temple, he presented it to his counselors, who accepted it and approved it. It was then presented to the quorum of the 12 apostles, who unanimously approved it, and was subsequently presented to all other general authorities, who likewise approved it unanimously. President Kimball has asked that I now read this letter. June the 8th, 1978, to all general and local priesthood officers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints throughout the world. Dear brethren, as we have witnessed the expansion of the work of the Lord over the earth, we have been grateful that people of many nations have responded to the message of the restored gospel and have joined the church in ever-increasing numbers. This, in turn, has inspired us with a desire to extend to every worthy member of the church all of the privileges and blessings which the gospel affords. Aware of the promises made by the prophets and presidents of the church who have preceded us, that at some time in God's eternal plan, all of our brethren who are worthy may receive the priesthood, and witnessing the faithfulness of those from whom the priesthood has been withheld, we have pleaded long and earnestly in behalf of these, our faithful brethren, spending many hours in the temple, upper room of the temple, supplicating the Lord for divine guidance. He has heard our prayers, and by revelation has confirmed that the long-promised day has come when every faithful, worthy man in the church may receive the holy priesthood with power to exercise its divine authority and enjoy with his loved ones every blessing that flows therefrom, including the blessings of the temple. Accordingly, all worthy male members of the church may be ordained to the priesthood without regard for race or color. Priesthood leaders are instructed to follow the policy of carefully interviewing all candidates for ordination to either the Aaronic or the Melchizedek priesthood to ensure that they meet the established standards for worthiness. We declare with soberness that the Lord has now made known his will for the blessing of all his children throughout the earth, who will hearken to the voice of his authorized servants and prepare themselves to receive every blessing of the gospel. Signed, sincerely yours, Spencer W. Kimball, N. Eldon Tanner, Marion G. Romney, First Presidency. Recognizing Spencer W. Kimball as a prophet, seer, and revelator, and President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it is proposed that we as a constituent assembly accept this revelation as the word and will of the Lord. All in favor, please signify by raising your right hands. Any opposed by the same sign? President Kimball, it appears that the vote has been unanimous in the affirmative, and the motion has carried.
So, that happened before I was born, almost 40 years ago, but it was a pretty significant event in recent church history, and one that caused quite a bit of discussion afterwards. Some people maybe didn't like it, other people were very happy that it came. But at any rate, it changed a more than a century-old policy that the church had that had worked its way into the culture and traditions of the Mormons. But even though that happened, over 40 years ago, it's still something that's talked about, um, you know, fairly frequently, honestly. If you look just a couple years ago when Mitt Romney was running for president, the Washington Post did an article. This was late February 2012, in which they discussed uh, the priesthood ban in the Mormon Church. And in it, they interviewed a BYU religion professor, Randy Bott, and he explained to the Washington Post, which then published it, that according to Mormon scriptures, the descendants of Cain who killed his brother Abel were black. One of Cain's descendants was Egyptus, a woman Mormons believe was the namesake of Egypt. She married Ham, whose descendants were themselves cursed, and in the view of many Mormons, barred from the priesthood by his father, Noah. Bott points to the Mormon holy text, the Book of Abraham, as suggesting that all the descendants of Ham and Egyptus were thus black and barred from the priesthood. Now, it's interesting there, one little phrase, in the view of many Mormons. Now, just because something is held in the view of many Mormons does not mean necessarily that it's true. And the day after this article came out in the Washington Post, the church um, newsroom did two press releases. This first one here specifically referenced the Washington Post article, and it said the positions attributed to BYU professor Randy Bott in a recent Washington Post article absolutely do not represent the teachings and doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Goes on to say, for a time in the church, there was a restriction on the priesthood for male members of African descent. It is not known precisely why, how, or when this restriction began in the church, but what is clear is that it ended decades ago. Some have attempted to explain the reason for this restriction, but these attempts should be viewed as speculation and opinion, not doctrine. The church is not bound by speculation or opinions given with limited understanding. We condemn racism, including any and all past racism by individuals both inside and outside the church. That was the day after that article came out. An interesting thing there is it is not known precisely why, how, or when this restriction began in the church. So this was the first of two press releases the church released the day after that Washington Post article came out. This one directly was in direct response to the Washington Post article. The next one here was just a general press release talking about race in the church. All are alike unto God. This one does not reference the Washington Post article, but is, obviously in response to it. It says people of all races have always been welcomed and baptized into the church since its beginning. In fact, by the end of his life in 1844, Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, opposed slavery. During this time, some black members were ordained to the church, to the priesthood. At some point, the church stopped ordaining male members of African descent, although there were a few exceptions. It is not known precisely why, how, or when this restriction began in the church, but it has ended. The church unequivocally condemns racism, including any and all past racism by individuals both inside and outside the church. In 2006, then Church President Gordon B. Hinckley declared that no man who makes disparaging remarks concerning those of another race can consider himself a true disciple of Christ. So, and then this press release ends by saying, recently the church has also made the following statement on this subject. The origins of priesthood availability are not entirely clear. Some explanations with respect to this matter were made in the absence of direct revelation, and references to these explanations are sometimes cited in publications. These previous personal statements do not represent church doctrine. Now, the following year, after this happened, the 2013, the church, released a new version of the scriptures, and in the introduction for the 1978 revelation, it now says, The Book of Mormon teaches that all are alike unto God, including black and white, bond and free, male and female. During Joseph Smith's lifetime, a few black male members of the church were ordained to the priesthood. Early in its history, church leaders stopped conferring the priesthood on black males of African descent. Church records offer no clear insights into the origins of this practice. Let me repeat that. Church records offer no clear insights into the origins of this practice. Now, that stood out to me. The press releases stood out to me as I was researching this revelation in preparation for this lesson. And one of the reasons that I decided to focus this entire lesson on this revelation was because we are seeing a common thread here in the press releases in response to the Washington Post article, in this 2013 introduction for the 1978 Revelation. And so I got to thinking about it and thought, well, maybe, this is kind of a new thing. Maybe, now we're 40 years beyond, and they're trying to separate themselves a little bit from it. But then I stumbled across a quote from Dallin H. Oaks that he gave. This was from an interview with the Associated Press published in the Daily Herald in Provo back on June 5th, 1988. He says, talking about the priesthood ban, he says, some people put reasons to the ban, and they turned out to be spectacularly wrong. The interviewer then asks him, when you say some people, are you talking about general authorities? Like, are you talking about the reasons that general authorities talking about? He responds by saying, I'm referring to reasons given by general authorities and reasons elaborated upon by others. The whole set of reasons seemed to me to be unnecessary risk-taking. That was in 1988. So this what we saw from the press releases and the introduction to the scriptures from a couple years ago, this isn't a new stance. And the reason why this really stood out to me is I served my mission about 15 years after Dallin H. Oaks said this quote. And while I was on my mission, I was given a transcript of a talk given by Alvin R. Dreyer, who was in the first presidency, who spent a lot of time discussing the premortal existence and faithfulness in the premortal existence and lack thereof, and the priesthood ban. And there were pages. This was quite a lengthy talk. It wasn't a general conference talk. It was given at a fireside or something, and it was quite a lengthy talk, and there were multiple pages with many, many reasons for the priesthood ban, all of which the church now vehemently denies are true. And Dallin H. Oaks in 1988 said, some people put reasons to the ban and they turned out to be spectacularly wrong. So while I was on my mission, I was reading this talk by Alvin R. Dreyer to learn more about the priesthood ban. And nobody, even though I didn't find that was actually given to me when I asked about it, because, of course, on my mission I was getting questions about the priesthood ban, and so I was given this talk by Alvin R. Dreyer. Nobody gave me this interview by Dallin H. Oaks. So even though 10 years had passed between the priesthood ban being lifted and Dallin H. Oaks giving this talk, and another 12, 15 years had passed from the time Dallin H. Oaks said this to the time I was inquiring about it, what was persisting was some of these spectacularly wrong reasons for the ban. And that's what I was being taught and told while I was asking about it on my mission. So I wanted to use this lesson to put an end to some of this speculation and spectacularly wrong reasons that were invented and made up to justify the ban. So that's what this lesson is going to be about. And we're going to start way back in the early church. The Book of Mormon was published in 1830, the year the church was organized, and it declares right in it, just like in the press release from the church a couple years ago, that all are alike unto God. It even specifically says black and white, are all alike unto God. The first documented black Mormon is a guy called Black Pete. There's not a lot known about him, but it was in Kirtland, Ohio, and in that very first year, 1830, when the church was founded. And, he was baptized into the church. Within a couple of months, you can find newspaper articles in both Philadelphia and New York that mention that the Mormons have a black man worshiping with them, and it's not a compliment. It's not a positive article. This is the 1830s, a very different time, and the people already had reservations about the Mormons, looked down on the Mormons, and the fact that the Mormons allowed a black man to join their congregation and worship with them was a negative, and the newspapers were not letting that go unnoticed. They made sure to point that out. And not long after that, at least two black men, Elijah Abel and Q. Walker Lewis, not only did they join the church, but they were ordained to the priesthood. And we'll talk about both of those guys in a little bit here. So, we're talking about a time when there's not a lot of black people where the church is. So, you wouldn't expect there to be a lot in the church. But when you look at proportions in the general population and proportions in the church and the attitudes of the people in the church, it appears like in these first few years of Mormonism, skin color has no bearing on anything. And one of the things that tells us that is an article by William W. Phelps. He was the publisher of the Morning and Evening Star in Missouri, and the members of the church firmly believed that Missouri was to be the gathering place, right? It was Zion. It was to be where all the Mormons were supposed to come. And William W. Phelps was well aware of the fact that there would be black Mormons, right? Because remember, we talked a couple weeks ago, I guess it's been a couple months ago now, about the Westminster Confession and about Mormon being an exclusive religion, but also an inclusive religion, right? And exclusive in that Mormons believe that they're the only way to get to heaven. They exclude all other religions, right? Mormonism is the one true church, but they're also inclusive in that Mormonism is for everybody. There is nobody who's excluded from Mormonism. Anybody can come and join with the Mormons and enjoy the restoration, right? And William W. Phelps is well aware of that, and he's well aware of the fact that there will be black people, especially since there's already a couple who are coming to Zion, coming to Missouri. And he's concerned about that because of the sentiment of the day, the attitudes, the culture of the day. So he writes an article in the Morning and Evening Star because he's concerned that they'll run into legal troubles when they come to Missouri, when they're gathering to Zion. He calls this article Free People of Color. And he's inviting all the free people of color to come to Missouri and join with the Mormons. But in the article, he quotes two sections of Missouri's legal code and warns them. He says, you need to have papers verifying your status that you're a freed black. Otherwise, the penalties in Missouri are that you will be whipped and expelled from the state. So he publishes this article because the Mormons want everybody to be a Mormon. They want everybody to enjoy the restoration, and they want everybody to gather to Zion in Missouri. But they're aware of the fact that that's not very easy for a black person in the 1830s to come to Zion, to come to Missouri. And so he writes this article and publishes it to kind of give them some pointers on ways to be able to come gather with the saints and not run into legal problems. Now, you might remember there was a manifesto of the mob in Missouri, the one that starts out saying that, we're going to get rid of the Mormons peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. They go on to say in this manifesto of the mob, uh, so they specifically point out the Free People of Color article by William W. Phelps. And they say, in a late number of the Star, there is an article inviting free Negroes from other states to become Mormons and remove and settle among us. It manifests a desire on the part of their society to inflict on our society an injury that they know would be to us entirely insupportable. And then they go on to say, we believe it a duty we owe to ourselves, our wives, and children, to the cause of public morals, to remove them from among us, and we are not prepared to give up our pleasant places and goodly possessions to them, or to receive into the bosom of our families, as fit companions for wives and daughters, the degraded and corrupted free Negroes and mulattoes that are now invited to settle among us. So, you may remember in Missouri that a mob comes into town, destroys William W. Phelps' house, destroys the office for the Evening and Morning Star, throws all the printing out on the street. This is when Mary Elizabeth and Caroline Rollins gather up the Book of Commandments and run off, right? This whole thing, this whole mob attack on this city started not because of anything other than William W. Phelps' article, Free People of Color. The Missourians could not bear, I mean, they were already a little on edge with the Mormons anyways, but they could not bear the thought that the Mormons would allow black people to come and join their society. That's where all of this mobbing, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. I found that very interesting, as I've heard that story 100 times of Mary Elizabeth and Caroline gathering up the Book of Commandments and running off, and the printing press being destroyed, and the couple guys being dragged out into the city center with the intention of being tarred and feathered. I mean, how many times have we heard that story, right? But I always just attributed it to normal persecution. They didn't like Mormons because they were Mormon, but that's not the case. The thing that caused the mob to actually come and destroy the printing press and do all that was that the fact that the Mormons were not prejudiced. That was the whole problem. Everybody else was prejudiced, and the Mormons were not, and so they couldn't handle that, and that was the impetus behind this confrontation. Very very interesting. It also, the editorial, Free People of Color, becomes the major reason for the Mormons' expulsion from Jackson County. It wasn't their faith, it wasn't anything else, it was the fact that they were not prejudiced. They were, they viewed everybody as a child of God, and didn't matter what color their skin was. An interesting secular view on this, a guy named Edward Strutt Abdy. He was an English legal academic, most notable as an author on racism and race relations in the U.S. He came and toured the United States in the 1830s and then went back to Britain and wrote a 3-volume book about his experiences, very similar to Alex de Tocqueville and his Democracy in America. So, in his books, Journal of a Residence and Tour in the United States of North America, he gives an account of the Mormons. He briefly describes their history. He kind of outlines the storyline of the Book of Mormon. And then he says, as the Mormons maintain the natural equality of mankind without accepting the native Indians or the African race, there is little reason to be surprised at the cruel persecution by which they have suffered. The preachers and believers were not likely to remain unmolested in the state of Missouri. So he's there, he's looking at this, and he places the persecution. The only reason that he really says that they're being persecuted is because they maintain the natural equality of mankind. The Mormons, according to Edward Strutt Abdy in 1830, have no qualms with Native Americans or African Americans. And he says that's the reason why they are being persecuted. Um, and then he goes on to say, later on, he quotes from the Book of Mormon, and he says, "The Lord God invited them all to come unto him and partake of his goodness, and he denieth none that come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. And he remembered the heathen, and all are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile." And so this secular writer, legal academic, viewing this from the outside, sure, maybe they got some peculiar doctrines, whatever, but that's not why they're being persecuted. That's not what's causing all these problems. The reason that these guys are having problems is because they maintain the natural equity of mankind. And he says the Mormons are not likely to remain in the state of Missouri unmolested. He knows that the Mormons' views on race relations is going to get them booted out of Missouri. Very interesting. Um, William W. Phelps did not learn his lesson the first time around, or maybe he just simply didn't care. He writes two more editorials a couple years later in 1835. Um, uh, and in one of them, most religious people in the 19th century uh, understood race through the Bible and believed that Noah's three sons explain racial distinction, right? Shem gives rise to Asians, Ham to Africans, and Japheth to Europeans. And Phelps obviously was a product of that culture, and he references that in a article called, I believe, The Ancient Order of Things, where he says all families of the earth should get redemption in Jesus Christ, regardless of whether they are descendants of Shem, Ham, or Japheth. So what he's saying is he doesn't care if people are Asian, African, or European. They're all welcome. They're all equal before God. And then a couple months later, he writes, all people are one in Christ Jesus, whether it was in Africa, Asia, or Europe. So even though the Mormon views on race is causing most of their persecution, and even though his article Free People of Color was the reason why the mob came to town and smashed his printing press and destroyed his home and offices and was going to tar and feather a couple people and eventually ran him out of Jackson County, that didn't matter to them. They understood that all people were children of God, and they weren't going to be bullied into being racist. That just wasn't going to happen. We also see this in Parley P. Pratt, his well-known tract Voice of Warning. In it, he speaks of his intent to preach to all people, kindred, tongues, and nations without any exception. And he includes in that India's and Africa's sultry plains, right? The view of the early Mormons is that Mormonism, like I said, is inclusive. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone is a child of God. Everyone needs to be a Mormon because it's the only way to heaven, right? And we see in Nauvoo, we see this uh, as they're building the temple and as the church is getting more organized and structured. This attitude is not changing. If you look at articles in the Times and Seasons in 1840, there's a report from the presidency, and in it they say the saints expected people from every land and every nation, the polished European, the degraded Hottentot, and the shivering Laplander, to come to Nauvoo. And they go on to say, this is a report from the presidency, and they welcomed persons of all languages and of every tongue and of every color, who shall with us worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple and offer up their orisons in his sanctuary. Now this is interesting because they are building the Nauvoo temple, and in the Times and Seasons, in a report from the presidency, they specifically say that persons of all languages, of every tongue and every color are welcome to Nauvoo to worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple, clearly stating that temple worship is for everybody, right? So here we are, 1840, we're 10 years into the church now, and they are very clear that there is no racist policies. There is no segregation policies. All children, black, white, male, female, bond, free, it doesn't matter. We're all children of God. We're all in this together, and we're all gonna, progress together. And if we look at interesting conversation that Brigham Young had, this is in March of 1847. So here we are, another 17 years after the church is founded. He has a meeting with a guy named William McCary, who is a black Mormon, and William is complaining about the way he's being treated among the Mormons. And in response to this, Brigham Young tells him, "It is nothing to do with the blood, for of one blood has God made all flesh." Right? So clearly, Brigham Young is saying here that of everybody is a child of God. So where Joseph Smith has been gone for 3 years at this point, and Brigham Young is maintaining this policy of equality. He goes on to tell William, he says, "We have one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, a barber." And he's speaking of Q. Walker Lewis, the guy we talked about before, in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. And Q. Walker Lewis, by this point, has been ordained an elder in the Melchizedek priesthood. And as the conversation goes on, and William McCary continues on about how bad he's being treated, Brigham Young flatly says, "We don't care about the color." So here we have Brigham Young, 3 years after Joseph Smith has been killed, and 17 years after the church has been founded, flatly stating that there is no segregation, there is no concern about skin color. We don't care about the color of your skin. Everybody is welcome. So interesting comments there by Brigham Young. And then probably the most famous example of this is Elijah Abel. Elijah Abel, it's believed he escaped slavery using the Underground Railroad. He was baptized just a couple years after the church was founded in 1832. 4 years later, he was ordained an elder, and later that same year, he was ordained a 70. He received his washing and anointing in the Kirtland Temple. He went on missions to Ohio, New York, and Canada, and then he was ordained to the Nauvoo 70s Quorum in 1839. He was baptized for the dead in the Nauvoo Temple, after which he served another mission, and then he crossed the plains in 1847. Now, this gentleman, he was a 70, he was ordained to the 70s Quorum in 1839 and then baptized for the dead in the Nauvoo Temple, but he was out of town. He had moved to Cincinnati when the endowment started, when Joseph Smith started giving the endowment to people, and so it's unknown, what would have happened there. But unfortunately, he was unable to get his endowments in Nauvoo because he wasn't there. And then by the time he crossed the plains, they had stopped the Nauvoo Temple work and what have you. So, but anyways, he does cross the plains, and we'll pick up his story of what happens once he gets to Salt Lake in a couple of minutes. But I want to discuss kind of the turning point, right? Because if you look at this, in Missouri, the Mormons were so adamant that color didn't matter and skin color didn't matter that they were willing to publish it, and they were willing to put up with mob persecution. Abdi's book, his journal of his time, he clearly states that in his view, the only reason the Mormons are being persecuted, or the main reason they're being persecuted, is because they maintain the equality of all mankind. They don't look down upon the Native Americans. They don't look down upon the African Americans. They view all as their brothers and sisters in Christ. And we see that trend all through the 1830s and all the way up, in 1847. We were just reading quotes from Brigham Young in 1847. So what happened? When did this change, and why? Well, it's impossible to point out, just like the press releases at the beginning that the church said. It's impossible to really point to a specific day or a specific time or a specific policy. But we start seeing a change in attitude. And one of the first places where it's documented is with this gentleman, William Appleby. So he's a convert to Mormonism of about 7 years in 1847, and he is sent to survey the East Coast branches of the church in the United States. And while he's there, he meets Q. Walker Lewis, the guy we were talking about, an ordained black elder in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. Now, William Appleby grew up in New Jersey, and we know from some of his writings and other things that he had some certain racist attitudes. Um, and so he's taking this survey of the East Coast branches, and he not only does he meet Q. Walker Lewis, an ordained black elder in the church, but he meets Enoch Lewis, who's Q. Walker Lewis's son, who is also black, obviously. But Enoch Lewis is married to Mary Webster, who is white, and this kind of sets off William Appleby. And he writes a letter to Brigham Young, essentially saying, what kind of church did I join here? Like, what is this? We've got, not only do we have black people in our church, but we have black people married to white people in our church. And so he sends a letter to Brigham Young. It's unknown if Brigham Young receives it or not, but they do meet in winter quarters on December 3rd, 1847. The meeting lasts for about 4 hours, and interestingly, the meetings don't mention anything about black members holding the priesthood. There doesn't seem to be any discussion or concern about that. But they do talk about race mixing and the fact that there is a interracial marriage in this Massachusetts branch. And Brigham Young is clearly opposed to that, even to the point where he says capital punishment should be the penalty if you have an interracial marriage. So this is the first time really where it's in the records, written into the history books, that there's some concern, some, maybe a changing attitude towards black people. Maybe they've always had this concern about interracial marriage, or maybe not. There's no way to really know. But this is the first time where you start seeing the sentiment change a little bit. And then, and that's the end of the same year where Brigham Young is telling William that they don't care about the color. So it's interesting that it's just a few months apart, those conversations. And then once you get into Salt Lake, there starts to be a little bit of confusion and concern. And you have slavery happening in Utah. Not only do you have Mormons from the South who own slaves, bringing them to Utah, and some of those slaves actually are Mormons themselves, but you also have Mormons beginning to slave trade with the Native Americans who are there in Utah. Not a, bright spot in Mormon history, but it is happening. And so Utah has to, or wants to come up with laws surrounding slavery, right? And this is not uncommon, right? Back in this time period, it was happening in many states. And so they are debating in the legislature an act in relation to service, is what it's called. Service, really, you could just read that as slavery. And in late January 1852, this is the first time where Brigham Young will openly articulate a race-based priesthood restriction that we know of. This is the first time that it actually gets recorded, and it's in the history books. And Orson Pratt is there, and he disagrees 100% with any priesthood restriction based on race. He moves that the legislature should reject Brigham Young's statements in their entirety. He argues only God can administer divine curses, and when God does, that they are particular to a given time and place, and they don't automatically pass down from generation to generation. And he says, quote, "Shall we take then the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so?" And then he continues to argue that Mormons are not acting on authority from God if they pass this servant code. And he found the idea preposterous, and he said that it was enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. So here you see kind of a clash, right? You see Orson Pratt kind of sticking to the old ways, what Joseph Smith taught, what William W. Phelps wrote about in the newspaper, what the first presidency talked about in the Nauvoo newspaper. This is where Orson Pratt is still living. He's flabbergasted that race would come into play at all. We're all children of God. The Book of Mormon says it. Black, white, bond, free. We're all children of God. And how can we do this? This is preposterous. It's enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. We have no authority from heaven to do so. And so Brigham Young is kind of the driving force for a ban, and Orson Pratt is the voice of reason here, really, and kind of sticking with what the church has been teaching for the last 20 plus years. But Orson Pratt loses, and on February 4th, 1852, they pass this act in relation to service. So here we see the tide changing, right? Here we're going in this other direction. And a couple days later, well, actually on that same day, February 4th, when they passed that, they're also debating the election code, for laws surrounding elections in Utah. Orson Pratt gives a speech. Unfortunately, it's not recorded. We don't know what he said. It's assumed that, at least part of his comments was discussing race, but we don't know because it wasn't recorded. And then the next day, Brigham Young gets up and says, referring to black people, "They will not rule over me in this church, and they will not rule over me in this territory." So, here we are, just 5 years after Brigham Young is saying, we don't care about the color, right? We got great black elders, we're all one blood. God used the same blood to make all mankind, and here we are 5 years later, where not only did he just push for a priesthood ban in the laws related to slavery, but now in the election code, he's specifically saying that black people will not be able to vote. And Orson Pratt argues that black men should be allowed to vote. And he votes against both the Cedar City Municipal Bill and the Fillmore Incorporation Bill, because in both of those they stipulate that only white men over the age of 21 are allowed to vote. And in the legislative minutes of this meeting, it simply reports Councilor Pratt opposed the bill on the ground that colored people were there prohibited from voting. But it passes anyways. So here we begin to see a sea change in thought, right? You have Orson Pratt representing the old ways, and you have Brigham Young kind of ushering this new attitude, these new ideas of segregation and even racism. So here's kind of where we start to see things change. And in this same year, in 1852, another thing happens that really kind of throws all this into the limelight, right? Polygamy is announced in 1852. Well, it's officially announced, right? People have been living it for longer, and it was known about for longer, but this is the year where it's officially announced and publicly discussed. And of course, as we all know, or most of us know probably, kind of sets the political world on fire. Political cartoons are all about Mormon polygamy. It becomes this big national conversation. But something that's not always talked about is it wasn't just polygamy that was being discussed. It was interracial mixing, because the Mormons had, for the whole time they were on the East Coast, been very open to anybody of any race. And so in a lot of the political cartoons that you see, it specifically calls out not only polygamy, but a view of all races being equal. You can see on the left here, there's some old guy with a bunch of little girls, all dressed in various native clothing, and underneath it says, a Mormon elder out with his 6-year-olds who take after their mothers. And there's a Native American, there's an Asian, there's a black person, etc. The one on the right, affecting it's Brigham Young from his interesting little family, and you see his wives there, many of whom are black, and then the one in the foreground there, a Mormon family out for a walk. You see some old guy out front, followed by a bunch of wives of various races, and then a bunch of kids. So when polygamy was announced, it exploded on the national stage, and a lot of Americans mixed polygamy with interracial mixing, and it was just unbearable. Polygamy by itself was bad. Viewing all races as equal was bad, but you put the two together, and it was a tinderbox. It was not good at all. We talked a couple weeks ago about Johnson's Army in 1857 when it came to Salt Lake. There was a doctor with them, Dr. Roberts Bartholomew, and when they get back, he files a report with the United States Senate, and in it he says the Mormon of all human animals now walking this globe is the most curious in every relation. And by the end of 1860, they actually call a conference at the New Orleans Academy of Sciences on the degraded Mormon body and the production of a new race in the Great Basin. And they talk about how the Mormons having one man with many wives, and having one man with many wives of different races, is actually creating a whole new race. And there's many doctors at this conference, and all of them, except one, buy Bartholomew's argument that the Mormons are creating this new race. And so there's this huge amount of concern in the United States about the Mormons, and the doctors of the day are saying that they're creating this new race. And so we see news articles talking about, quote, here's one quoted here. It says, "The days of the white race are numbered in this country." And it says, the Americans of the future are a black Mormon. And so, we hear a lot about persecution due to polygamy, persecution due to the doctrines of the church or whatever. But what you find as you look back through this early church history is a lot of the persecution is related to race relations. The Americans really didn't like the fact that the Mormons didn't look down on anybody, at least for the first couple decades of the church's existence. Everybody was welcome. Everybody was viewed as equal. And then once they got out west, and once they announced polygamy, it just opened this can of worms, and it was a big deal, a big problem. And the Mormons were well aware of this, right? They knew that the East Coast, the Americans on the East Coast were just working themselves up in a frenzy, saying the Mormons were creating this whole new race. And it's against such a charged national racial backdrop that Mormons responded with an effort to claim whiteness for themselves. They actually don't necessarily disagree that they're creating a new race, but whereas all the Americans say that this is a degraded race and it's going to be, the end of humanity or whatever, the Mormons are saying they're creating a celestial race or whatever. But at any rate, these Mormons are white European for the most part, and they don't want to be um, degraded and looked down upon, so they have to find a way to claim whiteness for themselves, right? We are white, and Brigham Young starts to draw upon the curses of Cain and Ham and Canaan to bar black men from the priesthood, and these are long-standing Judeo-Christian traditions. It's not something that he's just making up. And then, that's later leaders expand the policy to include temple worship, and they bar black adults from temple worship. I mean, it's kind of in uh, this the motivation here is to still be considered white Americans, and not be degraded as something less. So while all this is going on, remember Elijah Abel, he went out west, right? So while all this is going on, he's still there. He still has the priesthood. He's still in the office of a 70. He's still serving missions. But all around him, the race relations are breaking down. And blacks are no longer able to be ordained to the priesthood. Um, when he gets to the Salt Lake Valley, he actually works on the Salt Lake Temple as a carpenter. He goes on another mission in 1884. He passes away shortly after returning in December of 1884. And here's a snapshot of his obituary from the Deseret News. And if you look at it, it's kind of unique as an obituary, at least from what I can tell, in that it calls out all of his ordinations to the priesthood. It's as if, I don't know who wrote it. I don't know that anybody knows at this point who wrote it. But they don't say Elijah Abel was a great guy, left his wife, left his children. They specifically call out, Elijah Abel was a faithful priesthood holder. And not only was he a priesthood holder, but here, let me tell you the dates that he was ordained. It's as if whoever wrote it wants to make sure, wants history to remember that Elijah Abel had the priesthood, that he got it on these dates, and that all was okay at that point for him, and what happened. Um, Interesting little side note about Elijah Abel. He did appeal to John Taylor and ask if he could get his endowments in the temple, and John Taylor didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, because at that point they had a ban on the priesthood for black men, but Elijah Abel already had it, and so they couldn't really take it away. But since he has it, can he go in the temple? And they had this big investigation. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to handle it. He was ultimately denied, and they didn't allow him to get his endowments. But it caused a lot of confusion in the leadership of the church. They didn't know what to do, and so with that, they started putting more defined policies in place. Right? We already had a priesthood ban. Well, now we need to define that a little bit more, because we can't have people asking us questions and we not know the answers. So unfortunately, Elijah Abel, even though he was a faithful net member, served a bunch of missions, he was never able to get his endowments. And so with that, though, as they're trying to put more definitions around this policy and trying to understand really what it is they're trying to do, you fast forward a few years to 1907. This is when, this is shortly after President Joseph F. Smith has been called before Congress, because Congress says that polygamy is still happening, even though the Mormons say it isn't. So the Mormons are having a lot of issues here, right? They get with the polygamy thing and everything else. And so they release a statement in 1907 regarding race and the priesthood. And it says, the descendants of Ham may receive baptism and confirmation, but no one known to have in his veins Negro blood, it mattereth not how remote a degree, can either have the priesthood in any degree or the blessings of the temple of God, no matter how otherwise worthy he may be. So they're really trying to put some definition around this, right? Um, that's what's happening here at the same time that they're trying to, vehemently deny polygamy, even though it is still kind of occurring. I mean, there's a lot of chaos and problems and confusion at this point in the church. And the next year, they have another problem. They receive a letter from Elder Ralph A. Badger, who's the president of the South African Mission, and in it, he wished to know, this is taken from the minutes of the first presidency meeting, it says he wished to know if the gospel should be preached to the native tribes, and states that an old native missionary has become a member of the church at Queenstown and is anxious to start an active missionary work among the natives, and that the son of a Zulu chief had also been baptized who had requested that missionary work be done among the Zulus. So they get a letter from the president of the South African Mission saying there's a native who's become a missionary and wants to go spread it to all the tribes, and the son of a Zulu chief has been baptized and he wants to go do the work among the Zulus. And so now they got to figure this out, right? Like, okay, last year we announced that this, specification about the policy when it comes to black people, but we still got missionary work going on there. So what are we going to do? And so they decide that missionaries, quote, should not take the initiative in proselyting among the Negro people, but if Negroes or people tainted with Negro blood apply for baptism themselves, they might be admitted to church membership in the understanding that nothing further can be done for them. Right? So this is 1908. So, the church starts out the first couple of decades with absolutely no segregation, absolutely no racist policies, absolutely nothing. By the 1850s, when polygamy is released, they're starting to, claim for themselves, hey, we are normal, we are Mormon, we are white, we are Americans, and they start, putting in these the polygamy is causing a bunch of problems, so they start, and the racism thing is causing, or the race equality thing is causing problems. So it takes them multiple decades to kind of get this all defined. And here we are in 1907, 1908, where they're finally getting, a box drawn around this policy. But the problem is, this is about the time where culture is swinging the other way, right? Back in the 1830s, 1840s, they were way ahead of their time. And then they spent the next multiple decades backpedaling, trying to get more in line with the culture of the day. And by the time you get to 1907, 1908, when they're finally, where Americans would have expected them to be back in the 1830s, Americans have progressed, right? And so this is about the time, you start seeing the civil rights movements and things, they're starting to come in. This is the very early stages of those, but they kind of were ahead of their time and then overshot as they went backwards. But it wasn't lost, as if you go forward in time from 1908 a little bit, and you get up to David O. McKay's day, he was aware of the issues here in the 40s and 50s. Racial integration was becoming more common in American life, but it only been a couple of decades since the Mormon Church had really, put their foot down. The first presidency had released these statements, and the church had always allowed Pacific Islanders to hold the priesthood, and President McKay was interested in race. If you read his biography, it's a very interesting, his interactions with these policies and this and how he felt about it. He clarified that black Fijians and Australian Aborigines could be ordained to the priesthood, and he instituted missionary work among them. And he emphasized that the restriction extended only to men of black African descent. And in South Africa, he reversed the prior policy that required prospective priesthood holders to trace their lineage out of Africa. He was very progressive, but he was up against a lot of tradition at this point. The 1950s, that article I referenced that was given to me on my mission by Alvin R. Dreyer. It was given in the 1950s. So here, David O. McKay is there at a time when general authorities are making things up. Like Dallin H. Oaks says, they're spectacularly wrong, but they're trying to justify this policy. And David O. McKay recognizes that it's not good, right? And a quote from him right here. He says, there is not now, and there never has been, a doctrine in this church that the Negroes are under a divine curse. There is no doctrine in the church of any kind pertaining to the Negro. We believe that we have a scriptural precedent for withholding the priesthood from the Negro. It is a practice, not a doctrine, and the practice someday will be changed, and that's all there is to it. So he's aware of the issues here, but he's also surrounded by a bunch of people who um, are steeped in the culture and the tradition, and they've been making up these reasons, and they've been propagating these, and people are believing them and spreading them. And so David O. McKay, if you read his biography, he struggles with this, and he wants to change it, but he can't. It would cause an uproar, right? And something I want to point out, he says, we believe that we have a scriptural precedent for withholding the priesthood from the Negro. As mentioned earlier, that's the the typical Judeo-Christian idea from the time back when Brigham Young was talking about Ham and Cain and Canaan. He's not talking about the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was never used by any leaders of Mormonism, at least that I can find, or that in what I've read, to justify priesthood or temple restrictions against African Americans. Even though it does talk about a skin of blackness coming upon people and whatever, none of the leaders of the church ever used that to justify any restrictions or anything against African Americans. The Book of Mormon was about Native Americans, and the Mormons believed that it was those fallen descendants of ancient Israel that the Book of Mormon was talking about, and it had nothing to do with African Americans. In fact, Brigham Young actually told some Mormon missionaries to marry Native American wives to help make them white and delightsome. So even though, when David O. McKay says we believe we have scriptural precedents, nobody in church history ever used the Book of Mormon to justify that. So, fast forward a little bit again, the 20 years after David O. McKay said that quote, the revelation came out, priesthood was extended to everybody, and a quote from Jeffrey R. Holland in a PBS interview 10 years ago in 2008. He says, one clear-cut position is that the folklore must never be perpetuated. I have to concede to my earlier colleagues. They, I'm sure, in their own way, were doing the best they knew to give shape to the policy, to give context for it, to give even history to it. All I can say is, however well-intended the explanations were, I think almost all of them were inadequate and or wrong. He goes on to say, it probably would have been advantageous to say nothing, to say we just don't know. And as with many religious matters, whatever was being done was done on the basis of faith at that time. But some explanations were given and had been given for a lot of years. At the very least, there should be no effort to perpetuate those efforts to explain why that doctrine existed. So here's Jeffrey R. Holland, right, saying almost all of those well-intended explanations were wrong, and there should be no effort to perpetuate those efforts to explain it, right? That was 4 years before that Washington Post article that I started this out with. And I read these quotes, and I wonder to myself, why was I given that Alvin R. Dreyer talk on my mission? Why isn't that being shredded and burned? Why was I not given the quotes from David O. McKay saying there is no policy, it will change? From Dallin H. Oaks saying those things are spectacularly wrong. What is going on here? One of the final quotes I want to read is from Bruce R. McConkie. Now, Bruce R. McConkie was a very staunch supporter of the priesthood ban and very vocal. And he was alive when the 1978 revelation came out, and he gave a talk in BYU just a couple months after that revelation came out. The talk was called All Are Alike Unto God. And in it he says, there are statements in our literature by the early brethren which we have interpreted to mean that the Negroes would not receive the priesthood immortality. I have said the same thing. And people write me letters and say, you said such and such. And how is it now that we do such and such? And all I can say to that is forget everything that I have said, or what President Brigham Young, or President George Buchanan, or whomsoever has said in days past that is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with a limited understanding. We have now added a new flood of intelligence and light on this particular subject, and it erases all the darkness and all the views and all the thoughts of the past. They don't matter anymore. It doesn't make a particle of difference what anybody ever said about the Negro matter before the first day of June of this year, 1978. So that's pretty clear, right? Pretty clear. Bruce R. McConkie, 1978, saying it doesn't matter, forget it, this is the new policy, right? Fast forward to 2012, we have BYU religion professors going on record in the Washington Post talking about all those things that Bruce R. McConkie says don't talk about. I don't know what to say to that. In closing, one of my favorite quotes from Joseph Smith. I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. They cannot stand the fire at all. How many will be able to abide a celestial law and go through and receive their exaltation? I am unable to say, as many are called, but few are chosen. So, here's the deal. The policy related to blacks in the priesthood was simply a tradition. There was no basis in doctrine. I mean, that was known at least as far back as David O. McKay saying it in the 50s. It was simply a policy, simply a tradition, right? And in 1978, that tradition came to an end. That policy was changed. And yet, fast forward 40 years, and we still have people who are stuck in the past, who are still propagating made-up reasons, made-up stories about the policy. And so my question to you is, what about you? What about these other revelations, these continuing revelations to Latter-day Prophets? How many of them go against your traditions? How many of them go against things that you're used to, or that you believe, or that you made up reasons to do? And are you going to change? Or are you going to spend the next 40 years stuck in the past? Something to think about.